These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? Clearing paths. In the following positions there is a rook fork waiting to happen, two enemy pieces on the same rank or file, one of them loose, or one of them the king, or both. But there are pieces between them, or between the rook and the forking square, that have to be gotten out of the way for the double attack to work. Again, it is important to recognize the basic visual patterns involved: enemy pieces on the same rank or file, suggestive of a fork without being thrown off by obstructing pieces that you might be able to remove. Look for visual patterns in the position to the left. We see a familiar layout of black pieces, with the king and a loose knight prime targets for a fork on the 7th rank. If white could get a rook between them, the knight would be his. The black pawn at e6 is the only thing in the way. The natural method for getting a pawn out of the way is to take something it protects. Here it protects the pawn on d5, so white takes it with bishop takes at d5. If black replies pawn from e6 takes bishop, now rook moves to e7, check. Forks king and knight. The net gain is a pawn. White to move. What is the best move? White has no checks that are immediately productive, though knight moves to e7, check. Is not bad, so he looks for any black pieces that might be loose. There is one, the bishop on h6. He has no direct way to attack it, but since a loose enemy piece is a big opportunity, white considers whether he might build a double attack against it. Look for a visual pattern: the bishop is on the same rank as the black queen. If the pieces between them could be cleared out of the way, white would have a fork with rook moves to c6, the rook would be protected from queen takes rook by the pawn on d5. Of the two men in the way, white can control its own, the knight at c6. Where can it move, and with what results? The only capture it can make is knight takes knight. Black would reply pawn from d6 takes knight, the pawn gets pulled off the 6th rank. Now the way is clear for rook moves to c6, forking bishop and queen and thus winning a piece. The initial capturing sequence here illustrates a pattern of general interest: when two pieces need to be cleared off of a path, sometimes moving one of them also can force away the other. White to move. What is the best move? Look for a pattern, look for enemy pieces arranged on the same line. Black's king, rook, and bishop are spread along the back rank. If the rook were out of the way, there would be a classic setup for a double attack with white's rook, a king and loose bishop on the same rank with nothing between them. Can the black rook be attacked? No. Can white attack something the rook protects? What does it protect? The knight on e4. So white takes the knight with knight takes knight, black responds with rook takes knight, and now with the black rook out of the way, white plays rook moves to d8, check. And wins the bishop. That would be one way to see the position, another would be to begin by experimenting with captures. White sees that he can play knight takes knight. Automatically he imagines it and considers what it would do to the board. It would cause black to play rook takes knight. Then what would be possible, especially what checks? Answer: the fork rook moves to d8, check. White to move. What is the best move? When the queens are faced off against each other like this, exchanging them is an option both sides have to consider at every turn. A capture by either player will require an immediate recapture, which may open lines, leave loose pieces elsewhere, etc. Here white imagines queen takes queen and black's compulsory recapture knight takes queen. This simple sequence leaves behind loose black pieces on c5 and f5, whereas there were no loose black pieces before, and a clear path for white's rook from e1 to e5, whereas there were two pieces in its way at the outset. Now the rook fork rook moves to e5 wins a piece. This position is a good illustration of how a single exchange can radically alter the tactical opportunities on the board. The solution is easy enough to spot if you understand the significance of loose pieces, and probably impossible if you don't. Black to move. What is the best move? Start by seeing that the tension in the position is focused on c4, black has two pieces attacking the bishop there, white has two pieces defending it. This means black can't win anything immediately with captures on that square, but if you stop there you're thinking about the position the wrong way. The important question when you have a chance to force a series of exchanges is how the board would look afterwards, what checks you then would have, and whether any of them would be, or could be made into, forks or other tactical devices. Okay, so imagine liquidating the pieces trained on c4. Black plays bishop takes bishop, and white replies rook takes bishop, black plays rook takes rook, and white replies rook takes rook. The two sides have traded bishops and rooks. More importantly, one of the rooks in white's battery is off the board and the other ends up on c4, leaving white's back rank weak, bereft of defenders. The natural thought for black, then, is to drop one of his own rooks there with check, rook moves to d1, check. This forces white's king to f2 on the same file as the b2 bishop, which would have been left loose by the exchanges that started the sequence. The rook fork rook moves to d2, check. Then wins the bishop next move. The prospect of a rook fork is nowhere in sight at the outset of this position. You would see it only by patiently imagining the exhaustion of exchanges on c4, then your next check, then the resulting pattern with the king and loose bishop on the same line. If the latter position were set in front of you, its solution would be clear. It is worth studying this position until its solution is equally clear, because you are able to visualize the consequences of those initial moves. Notice that it involves several of our major themes in constructing forks: creating a loose target, loosening the forking square, and moving the enemy king onto a square where it can be forked. Black to move. What is the best move? You might start here by looking for visual patterns for black to pursue. The key thing to notice is the spread of pieces on the second rank, and especially the white bishops there. Of course there are pieces between them, but if the queens were removed a double attack would be possible. As usual, the second rank is a great place for a fork because it can't be defended by pawns. The bishops there are especially nice targets because unlike the white queen that also is there, they wouldn't be able to strike back at a rook that jumped between them. So black goes to work to get rid of the obstructions, starting with the obstructing piece that he can control, his own queen. Experiment with exchanges. If black plays queen takes queen, white plays rook takes queen. Now only the white rook would prevent a fork of the two bishops. Can it be taken? No. Can something it protects be taken? No. But can the rook be threatened and perhaps driven away? Yes, with bishop moves to b4. White moves the rook so as to avoid bishop takes rook, and now black plays rook moves to c2, attacking both of the now loose bishops and winning one of them. Black to move. What is the best move? Working with mate threats. What white pieces are loose? The bishop at c3. Black needs a way to attack it and attack something else at the same time, preferably the white king. His queen is off the board, so what might he do with his rook? He can attack the loose bishop with rook moves to d3. That move doesn't attack the king directly, but the opportunity presented by the loose piece is important, so think harder. Examine the white king's position carefully. The bishop at b6 cuts off the g1 square. The bishop on e4 pins the pawn on g2. So if black could get a rook onto the h-file, it would be mate. This idea can be put together with the previous one. Rook moves to d3 both attacks the bishop and threatens to end the game with rook moves to h3, checkmate. After white fends off the mate threat, black plays rook takes bishop. The lesson is to always be aware of the enemy king, not to mention your own, and any of your pieces that constrain it. The motif illustrated by this position, the fork that targets an enemy piece at one end and threatens mate at the other, is familiar from the previous chapters. It occurs less often with the rook than with the other pieces we have considered because the rook less often is in position to do both of those things. We consider it here only briefly. Black to move. What is the best move? This time you might begin by inspecting the enemy king, white's, and the constraints on its movement. Black's bishop attacks h2, and g1 is off limits because white's own knight is there. So the white king has very limited mobility, and this vulnerability is a tactical opening. If black could just aim another piece at the king, he might have a mating threat. Even if it were easily thwarted, it might enable him to win material by serving as the anchor for a double attack. Best of all would be to land an attacker on h2, since black already covers that square with his bishop. His rook can prepare to do this with one. Rook moves to f2. This creates multiple threats at once, which is your general goal as a tactician. The first threat is that white's queen is now attacked twice and guarded just once, by the knight on g1. If white's queen moves, either to play queen takes queen or just to get someplace safer, black also threatens to mate with rook moves to h2. If white replies to rook moves to f2 with queen takes rook, then of course black plays queen takes queen. White's best reply probably is to play his own rook from d7 to d2, thus preparing to recapture, with a loss, after black plays rook takes queen. Black to move. What is the best move? Strategic implications. Rooks do not need to be in the center of the board to be effective. In principle, at least, they have the potential to attack the same number of squares of full rank, and a full file no matter where they sit on the board. They generally do need to be moved out of the corners to gain power, however, and moving a rook toward the middle of the board has the particular advantage of making it easier to launch double attacks with the rook against pieces on the same file, i.e., pieces aligned vertically. It stands to reason, double attacks require rooks to get between two enemy pieces. The farther the rook is advanced into the center, the greater the opportunities for enemy pieces to end up on both sides of it. Likewise, rooks on the four middle files are more likely to be able to get between enemy pieces lying on the same rank, i.e., aligned horizontally. Glance at where the rooks that inflicted the double attacks in this chapter generally were positioned at the start of the sequence. Ideally, that is where you want your rooks to be, centralized. Whether they do their work out on the board or from posts on the back rank, what rooks most generally require are open files ahead of them. They don't do much good sitting behind their own pawns unless the pawn is on its way to promotion on the opponent's back rank. Make it a priority to get your rooks onto open files, or half-open files where none of your own pawns sit, even if your opponent still has a pawn in place. Move your rooks there or move pawns out of their way by making captures with them. Indeed, there is a whole opening the king's gambit premised partly on this idea. White offers to sacrifice his f-pawn on the second move, as shown to the left. What does this pawn push on the second move have to do with rooks? Everything. Once his f-pawn is gone, White will have a half-open file onto which he can bring his rook just by castling on the king side a few moves later. That rook suddenly can easily become a terror, bearing down on f7, typically a weak point in Black's position. Of course there are many other consequences of the king's gambit. It's a complicated opening. The point for now is just to see how gaining an open avenue for a rook can be a part of the planning from the first steps of the game. In a sense, all this is just another application of some principles given at the end of the chapter on the bishop fork. Here, as there, pawn moves are significant in part because of the lines they open and close. From an offensive standpoint, a pawn capture that creates an open line for a rook may be very valuable for just that reason. From a defensive standpoint, think carefully about any capturing sequences that will have the effect of opening files for your opponent's rooks. And once a file does open, try to claim it by planting a rook at its base. The positions in this chapter also underscore another point we have seen elsewhere, the importance of creating open lines to the enemy king and of avoiding open lines to your own king. In the rook's case, an open line includes the back rank if it can get that far and no defenders are there. Anytime an enemy rook has an open path to your back rank, or a path obstructed only by its own pieces, start worrying. Anytime your own rook is in that position, start experimenting. White to move. What is the best move? The pawn fork. Introduction. We now consider double attacks by the pawn. This chapter, too, is shorter than the earlier ones on forks because attacking patterns involving the pawn tend to be simple. A pawn can fork two enemy pieces that are on the same rank and separated by one square. E.g., the black rook and knight in the diagram, which can be forked with pawn from f2 moves to f4. Any two enemy pieces are fine, at least if the pawn has protection. The joy of attacking with pawns is that they are worth so little. A pawn for a piece, any piece, almost always is a good deal, so every piece must fear them. And of course you start with 8 pawns, and they often are near the combat zones of the board. They can jump from their starting position into the center in one move, and can move diagonally when they capture. We will see pawns taking advantage of all these capabilities in the examples that follow. By the way, what will happen in the diagram after white starts with pawn from f2 moves to f4? Black might try a classic line of reply to a fork. He can move one of his pieces out of it with check by playing rook moves to e1. Now white can't play pawn from f4 takes knight. he has to move his king to f2. But white still will make his gains, because now he threatens king takes rook and, still, pawn from f4 takes knight. Black can't escape both threats. White to move. What is the best move? Exchanges to create working pawn forks. White looks for a promising geometric pattern and sees that black has two pieces, the bishop and knight, on the same rank and separated by one square, the classic setup for a pawn fork. The only hitch is that the bishop is an unsuitable target because it can capture the pawn. White asks whether he can take the bishop with another piece, causing it to be replaced by a better target. He can, with knight takes bishop. Black recaptures with rook takes knight, and now white plays the fork pawn from f2 moves to f4, winning the knight after the rook moves. White to move. What is the best move? Here the concept is similar but harder to see. White almost has a pawn fork with pawn from d5 moves to d6, but the move attacks a queen and a pawn, an unsuitable target. If only the black king were on e7 rather than d7, and in that fantasy lies the solution: draw the king onto e7 by attacking the pawn there that only the king protects. White plays rook takes at e7, black replies king takes rook. If black moves the king, white skewers the queen with rook takes queen, and now the pawn push pawn from d5 moves to d6 wins the queen. The knight on c4 provides the protection the pawn needs to attack it. Notice, by the way, that white does all this while threatened with pawn from b5 takes knight. The usual lesson repeats: when under even an obvious threat, consider whether you can effectively go on the offensive with a check of your own. White to move. What is the best move? The same idea in different form. White sees that his pawn on g3 is one move from attacking the enemy queen on h5. The move would be a lot more interesting if it also attacks something else. There is not yet a working fork because on f5 black has a pawn an unsuitable target. So again white asks whether he has anything he can use to capture the pawn and cause it to be upgraded to a target that will work. He finds one option for the purpose: bishop takes at f5, check. Black's only legal reply is king takes bishop, leaving his king and queen in position to be forked with pawn from g3 moves to g4. Of course a pawn fork of the queen only works if the pawn has protection, and it does from the pawn on h3. Again, another way to have seen this would have been to examine every check. White has 2, rook moves to b6, which black escapes easily, and bishop takes at f5, which looks improbable but requires black to move his king to recapture. You imagine this response, see the telltale resulting position of black's king and queen, and take it from there. Black to move. What is the best move? Where does white have pieces vulnerable to a pawn fork? The knights on e4 and g4 are perfectly positioned. The only obstacle is black's own queen at f5. When our own pieces obstruct our plans, our first recourse is clear: try to move them out of the way in a violent fashion that requires a time-consuming response from the enemy. What can black attack with his queen? White's queen, 1, queen takes queen, 2 pawn from e2 takes queen, and now pawn from f7 moves to f5 wins a knight. Black to move. What is the best move? Where does white have pieces vulnerable to a pawn fork? He has pieces on c3 and e3, and black has a pawn at d5, so the makings of a fork are in view. There are 2 obstacles to its success: the white knight on d4 is in the pawn's way and will need to be cleared somehow, and if a bishop is going to be one of the targets of the fork, the pawn will need protection so it doesn't get captured. Once you understand that those are the problems you need to worry about, the solution is clear enough: play pawn from c7 moves to c5. The threat drives the knight away, every piece flees a pawn, and also creates protection for the d5 pawn when it then moves to d4, forking knight and bishop. It's worth having a good look at the starting position here. It's important to see the potential for a pawn fork in a situation like this despite all the other distracting pieces in the vicinity, particularly the knight on d4. White to move. What is the best move? What black pieces are vulnerable to a pawn fork? His knight and bishop, of course. What are the obstacles? The black queen, which blocks the pawn's path, and again the pawn will need protection if it is going to attack a bishop. The problems here are the same as in the previous problem, and so is the solution. Pawn from f2 moves to f3 drives away the queen and also provides protection to support the fork. Pawn from e3 moves to e4 that follows. Note that after 1 pawn from f2 moves to f3, black has to move his queen somewhere. Pay attention to where it will go, as its options are very limited. Black likely will play it to h4. Now white pauses to play the exchange too. Queen takes queen, pawn from g5 takes queen. He plays this first because his own queen is unprotected. Then he plays the fork in the middle of the board. White to move. What is the best move? By now the idea here should be easy to spot. Black's rook and c7 knight are a square apart on the same rank, and white's pawn on d5 is a square away from being able to fork them. The problem is that d6 is occupied by an enemy pawn. How do we get rid of it? In familiar fashion, take something it protects, forcing it to move to recapture. So white plays knight takes knight, black recaptures pawn from d6 takes knight, and now the fork pawn from d5 moves to d6 wins black's other knight. White to move. What is the best move? It is white's turn. 4 moves into the 4 knights opening. He is considering bishop moves to c4 to develop his pieces further. What happens if he plays that move? Picture it, his bishop and e4 pawn will be in the classic position to be forked by black's d-pawn, and black would be able to replace the pawn on e4 with a suitable target by playing knight takes at e4, inviting the reply knight takes knight. Now white's knight and bishop would be forkable with pawn from d7 moves to d5. True, white could then take black's pawn with his bishop, bishop takes at d5, but then black plays queen takes bishop. When the smoke clears, black will have won no material but will have a better position, a pawn in the center and both bishops ready to move. The point of the position is not the precise outcome, though. It is the importance of hesitating before leaving one of your pieces one square away from any of your own pieces or pawns on the same rank. Consider whether your opponent could start an exchange that would create a working pawn fork at the end. White to move. What is the best move? Forcing pieces into place with threats and checks. So far we've dealt with cases where your opponent began with two men ready to be forked by a pawn. One of them may have been an unsuitable target, e.g., an enemy pawn that needed to be upgraded with an exchange, but the basic geometric motif already was present. These next positions differ because the geometry for a pawn fork needs to be created. Enemy pieces have to be forced onto squares where they can then be forked. How do you force a piece onto the empty square where you want it to go? Sometimes a threat will do the trick. Normally your opponent will move a threatened piece someplace safe, but if it has a limited range of motion because some of its escape squares are blocked or attacked, a threat may force it where you want it to go. Consider this section a general set of lessons in paying careful attention to where threatened pieces will move. In this first example, white has a pawn that can jump into position to attack the black queen with pawn from g2 moves to g4. The threat is of limited interest by itself, but it would make a terrific first half of a double attack. If black's king could be goaded onto f5, white would have a pawn fork. Of course white's knight is there now, and black's king will want to avoid capturing it precisely because of the fork that then results. But whether these thoughts occur to you or not, on principle you would want to examine every check white can give and its consequences. White has a check at d4 with his knight that achieves nothing. He has checks with the queen at d7 and f7 that lose the queen right away, but another check at e7 where the queen enjoys protection from the knight. How would black respond? He would have to move the king with king takes knight. White imagines the board as it would then look and realizes that black's king and queen would then be forkable with pawn from g2 moves to g4. A loose end remains. When we went over white's checks, we left one out, rook moves to e1. It looks good, indeed, it forces the same initial result as queen moves to e7, black has to play king takes knight, and now white has that same pawn fork. But there is a grave difference in what follows from there. After white plays pawn from g2 moves to g4, black naturally moves his king away with king takes at f4, and then white has pawn from g4 takes queen, the execution of the fork, but now notice the state of the g-file. White's pawn no longer is there, the only things left behind are white's king and queen, a perfect chance for a pin by black, which he exploits with rook moves to g8. White can't move his queen, and will lose it next move. White's better starting move, queen moves to e7, avoids this calamity by getting the queen off the g-file right away. The general lesson of this last variation is to be careful to study all of your checks. Sometimes one looks as good as the next for a purpose on first inspection, but turns out to have quite different side effects. The more specific lesson is to be alert to one particular type of side effect, lines that get opened by a tactical sequence, such as the g-file in this case. This last possibility may seem startling and worrisome if you haven't studied pins, but once you get through that part of this project, you will know that the side of white's queen and king on the same line is something to notice from the beginning here. Black to move. What is the best move? Look for patterns in the layout of white's pieces or for threats you can make. The result either way should be to see black's potential pawn fork pawn from d4 moves to d3. The problem is that once the pawn arrives on the forking square it would be attacked twice by white's queen and rook and protected only once, by black's rook at d8. So the pawn gets taken if it steps forward. Yes, but let that sequence play out in your mind's eye. 1, d3, 2 rook takes at d3, rook takes rook, 3 queen takes rook, and now what would be possible on the resulting board? White's queen and knight would be arranged for the fork pawn from e5 moves to e4, winning the knight at f3. In effect, the initial fork was just another threat that drew the white rook, then, after an exchange, the white queen, into position for a different fork. Incidentally, note the importance of black playing the exchange rook takes rook, queen takes rook before executing the fork at the end. If black plays the pawn fork against white's rook and knight after the rook has moved to d3, white breaks out of it with rook takes rook, check. Once the rook has been replaced with white's queen, however, white has no good way to break out of the fork. The general points are, a. To always ask whether you can improve the target of a double attack with another exchange, and, b. To always consider what your opponent's best reply to the fork would be. He may have a check or threat that would enable him to break it, especially if his king is not one of the parties to the fork. White to move. What is the best move? Sometimes a threat by one pawn will force an enemy piece into position to be forked by another. The previous position was one example, here is another that works a bit differently. White sees that black's bishop has limited opportunities for escape, as the knight on c5 cuts off its main line to the rear. A bishop with so little room to retreat is a vulnerability you want to spot in your opponent's position and avoid in your own. So white gets interested in threats he can make against the bishop and their consequences, and looks at pawn from a 2 moves to a 3. Study the bishop's flight squares and you see that if it moves any deeper into white's territory it gets taken, so it has to move instead to a 5. Now black's bishop and knight would be a square apart on the same rank, so pawn from b2 moves to b4 would fork them. The pawn on a 3 gives the b4 pawn the protection it needs to be able to attack the bishop. The general lesson: keep an eye out for enemy pieces that are hemmed in by their own pieces or by the edge of the board. Often they have few options if they are attacked, making the consequences of the resulting sequence easy to predict and sometimes making a tactic easy to execute. White to move. What is the best move? The same idea. Again observe that black's bishop has limited motion, look behind it, it can't retreat toward a7. So white considers threatening it with pawn from b2 moves to b4. Here as before, black's bishop gets taken if it tries to escape by moving farther into white's territory. Instead black might play bishop moves to d6, putting the bishop one square away from the knight on the same rank. Now white forks the two pieces with pawn from e4 moves to e5, with cover for the pawn supplied by the bishop at f4. Or black replies to pawn from b2 moves to b4 with the suicide run bishop takes at f2, after white replies king takes bishop, black has knight takes at e4, check, and white ends up winning a piece for 2 pawns. Black to move. What is the best move? This time white's bishop on b5 is the piece with a limited ability to retreat. When you see a piece trapped in this way, think about threats against it. For black that means considering rook moves to d5 here. The bishop then gets taken if it moves to e2, d3, c6, d7, e8, or a6. Its only safe move and its only temporarily safe is bishop moves to c4. If white tries bishop moves to e8, black plays king moves to f8 and now the white bishop is attacked twice and defended once with nowhere good to go. Remember that black's rook would be on d5 black, what then would be possible? White's queen and bishop would be set up for the pawn fork. Pawn from b7 moves to b5, with black's rook at b2 furnishing the cover. White to move. What is the best move? No black pieces are poised to be forked. But again, it is good practice to examine the consequences of threats you can make by advancing your pawns. White has just one such threat to consider. Pawn from d4 moves to d5. The black knight would flee, but don't stop with that observation, ask where it would go. It has only one safe square, c7. Reevaluate the board as it then would look and notice that black's knights now would be a square apart on the same rank. Alternatively, after pushing forward a pawn to threaten something, you can always ask what would happen if you simply pushed it again. So pawn from d5 moves to d6 then wins a knight, with the bishop on g3 providing necessary protection against queen takes at d6. That is the idea, anyway. Against an alert player the outcome would be favorable but not quite so simple. As usual, you need to consider whether he might seize the offensive. Here black's best reply to pawn from d4 moves to d5 is not to move his knight to c7, it is to play end pawn from e7 takes at d5. Then when white plays pawn from e4 takes knight, black has the recapture queen takes at d5. White still gains a piece for 2 pawns, but black has reduced his losses nicely. There is a valuable defensive lesson in this for occasions when you find yourself the target of an unavoidable fork. If you are destined to lose a piece, you might as well do whatever damage you can with it, or with another piece you can sacrifice in its place. A doomed piece that has this odd sudden liberty to go on a suicide mission is known not as a kamikaze but as a desperado. Black to move. What is the best move? The drill: look at any threats you can make with your pawns and ask what consequences would follow. It is especially important to consider this when the threatened piece has little room for escape. Here black has the simple pawn from g7 moves to g6, putting pressure on the queen. The queen's freedom of movement is limited, it has to move to h4. Now what? Well, black can attack it again, pawn from g6 moves to g5, and now white is in a jam. To see why, consider his king, for it is affected by these movements of your g-pawn, which now seals off f4 and h4, and also protects those squares if you want to occupy them yourself. So look for your next check. Find bishop takes at f4 mate. This means that after black's second push of the g-pawn, white wouldn't want to play queen moves to h5. He would need to try pawn from f4 takes at g5. That f4 pawn of white's becomes the evident obstacle to the progress of this combination for black. But as we just saw, black has a way to take that pawn out while making a threat. Bishop takes at f4, check. That is the move to play, whether before or after the initial pawn push. Pawn from g7 moves to g6. Whether white replies king takes bishop or moves his king to h4, black's marching g-pawn then wins the queen. Naturally, you could have found the whole idea here by starting with the check bishop takes at f4. A similar result can be reached by skipping bishop takes at f4, check. At the beginning and just playing one. Pawn from g7 moves to g6, 2. Queen moves to h4, pawn from g6 moves to g5, 3. Pawn from f4 takes at g5 and now 3. Bishop takes at g5 attacks and wins the queen. The bishop has protection against capture, and if white tries to move the queen to safety on h5, black has pawn from f5 moves to f4, check. This forces king moves to h2, which in turn allows black to play rook moves to h1, checkmate.